If you're a policymaker, you probably want all the information in front of you. You'd like to be able to make a decision based on all information. But what we're seeing is that we're not getting all the information. In fact, there's a very organized and designed system that silences one side of the debate and amplifies the other. And that's a terrible way to make any decision in your life, to not have all the information. And we're making some of the most important decisions for our future. Energy stability, agriculture, transportation. These are, fundamental mainstays of our society. They've given us the standard of living that we enjoy so much.
This is Climate Debrief, brought to you by the CO2 Coalition. I'm Angela Wheeler. Today I'll be talking with Dr. Matthew Wielicki, an earth scientist with a broad range of expertise. Dr. Wielicki refers to himself as an earth science professor in exile. We'll find out more about that in a moment. Dr. Wielicki is a former assistant professor in the Department of Geological Sciences at the University of Alabama and a postdoctoral research scientist at UCLA in the Department of Earth, Planetary and Space Sciences and the Institute for Planets and Exoplanets. Dr. Wielicki, it's a pleasure to have you on Climate Debrief. Dr. Wielicki, you call yourself an earth science professor in exile and a climate and cultural realist. Let's start with earth science professor in exile. Regarding your exile, did you voluntarily leave or were you forced out?
Well, it's a little bit of both. I think the writing was on the wall as I was approaching tenure that the views that I had weren't very conducive to the community at the time. I think that's shifting a little bit now, and I'm very grateful for that. But it was definitely a little bit of both. I think if I would have tried to stay and pursue tenure, I wouldn't have got it. And so we both decided that parting ways would be the best scenario here. I stayed on for an extra year to help them kind of transition and teach some courses and things like that. So I really didn't have any bad blood with my former department. A lot of these former colleagues will tell you in private that they agree with you. They're just not dumb enough to say it out loud. And so I obviously didn't have a self-preservation instinct that a lot of my colleagues had. And I opened my mouth before I got tenure.
When you were young, your family fled Poland. Did your experiences in Poland and your family's journey to political asylum in the U.S. shape your perspective on intellectual freedom and the role of open discussion in society?
Absolutely. I was very young when we immigrated from Poland, the People's Republic of Poland at the time. But it was a lot of the stories that I would hear from my parents and a lot of the expats that came with them. To all over the United States, like all good Polish immigrants. We went to Chicago first. That's the Ellis Island for Polish people. And my father ended up in Southern Illinois for a little while. And he knew that as an academic, you just couldn't go back at that time. This is early 80s. The martial law was imposed very, very soon after we left. And, he couldn't even tell my mother that she was coming to visit with 2 suitcases and 2 young kids, my brother and I. And he couldn't tell her that they weren't going to go back because he was scared they wouldn't let him leave. And so when we got here, he kind of sprang it on us that we can't go back because he was afraid that he would be arrested if he went back. And as an academic freedom is the underpinning of all of academia. When we go back to Plato's idea of a university, you're talking about people shouting at each other and debating and this battlefield of ideas. And then you all go off and enjoy dinner. And I found that very exciting. I loved that. I grew up on a college campus. My father was an academic. And so that definitely shaped the way I viewed things. I definitely started to see a lot of the incremental steps and things like the climate alarmist movement or DEI at universities, these very small incremental steps that were really taking away from our ability to discuss ideas. There was these taboo subjects that you couldn't discuss. Even asking questions was enough to get you labeled a heretic. And so, long discussions with my father, he was saying, man, I don't understand. We fled a country to get away from this. And I see, academia making the same mistakes over again. And it was just very unfortunate to see. And it's not one big sweeping movement. It's these little incremental steps. And I think I was a little bit more sensitive to that than a lot of my colleagues were because of these past experiences and the stories that I had heard from my parents and their friends.
I recently saw a video clip where you stated that you observed a change in the academic environment from a merit-based system to one influenced by immutable characteristics. What specific examples did you see at the University of Alabama or UCLA that led you to this conclusion, and how did they impact your teaching or research?
So the biggest one that I really pushed back on at the University of Alabama was we were dropping the GRE as a requirement. So that's the graduate exam for graduate school. And we were dropping that because of the idea of equity and the idea that there were some students that could afford tutors and could afford these expensive textbooks and these kind of training guides, and they were scoring better on the GRE. But for me, as someone that is trying to bring in a graduate student that will be successful in my research program, it's very difficult for me to try to figure out who would be successful without some sort of standardized test. I couldn't really rely on grades. Some of these folks are coming from foreign countries where they use a completely different grading system. Some of these folks were coming from schools that graded much harder than others. So it's very difficult. And reading an essay, I'm supposed to somehow put myself in their shoes, understand the socioeconomic problems that they were going through, and somehow pick a student that would be successful in the school and as well as in my graduate program. And so it just shocked me that we were moving away from some sort of way to figure out whether these students had the capacity to be successful. I'm an isotope geochemist. I really need somebody that has a quantitative mind. They have to have advanced calculus. They have to understand differential equations. It's very important for me to understand how their analytical mind works. And the GRE is a great tool for that. We could have an analytical side. We have a verbal side. We have a writing component, especially for foreign students to understand whether or not they were very proficient in the English language. Obviously, that's very important for a scientist. We have to communicate through papers and through grants. And so we're always writing our ideas down. The fact that they were removing that in the name of equity, to me, was shocking. And I pushed back dramatically, but this was a trend that was happening in all these universities. We were putting much more value in what you mentioned before, immutable characteristics. The amount of melanin in someone's skin, something they can't change or affect at all, was more important than their grades or their ability to take a standardized exam. And I found that as a terrible a path to go down, not only for the university and for a faculty member like me, because the chances that I get an unproductive student go way, way higher. And I'm reliant on my students to produce the data that we need for papers, for grants. It's not a one-person operation. You have a whole research group, and you really rely on your students. And it was also terrible for the students because many of these students were getting set up to fail. They were coming into programs they had no business being in, and they were frustrated as well. So this was just, maybe the intentions were good here, but the outcome was exactly the opposite of what they were going for. And that was what I kept pushing back. I said, look, maybe you guys have the best intentions in the world. I'm not going to pretend to know what your intentions are. But as an analytical scientist, I'm going to look at outcomes. And if the outcomes aren't fitting what you intended to do, then we have to change something. We can't just keep doing the same thing. So there was many of these examples, but the GRE was a one that really shocked me. And that's one that's really taken, in almost all universities now, for the physical sciences, they're dropping the GRE in the name of equity.
And now switching gears to something else I mentioned earlier. In your bio on your Substack, Irrational Fear, you state that you are a climate and cultural realist. It is my understanding that you argue there's a disconnect between the science of climate change and the mainstream media narrative. Can you provide examples of scientific data or findings that you believe are misrepresented in public discussions?
Yeah, I would say anything that doesn't fit the predetermined narrative. So the narrative has been built. The narrative is that the planet is warming at an unprecedented rate. That warming is directly due to anthropogenic CO2 emissions, primarily from fossil fuel for energy. When we start to look at data, it gets much more complex, and papers that don't really fit the narrative essentially get ignored. This is how we essentially manufacture a consensus. The community, and this is why the media is always going to do this. If it bleeds, it leads. They kind of always sensationalize things. But I really am upset that the community doesn't speak up more and say, look, the narrative that the planet is going to end in 8 or 10 or 12 years, whatever the doomsday clock has on it now, is just not supported by any evidence. And even the IPCC doesn't use any of this verbiage, but the community itself never really wants to speak up. It's so toxic to push back against the predetermined narrative that people kind of bite their lip. And I argue that we're doing more disservice to science because we're making people kind of mistrust science. They're being sold a narrative, and when they start to dig into it, they find that it's much more complicated than it really is. A perfect example would be the recent headlines about accelerated warming. Almost on every news channel in the past week or two, there has been a story about accelerated warming from a recent paper that was published in Geophysical Research Letters. That's a journal I published in myself, a very well-respected journal. And it talks about acceleration of warming. So this is something we're always worried about. Is climate changing faster than it did in the past? Then we have some concerns. And they make the claim that it is. And what they essentially do is completely ignore a paper that came out just over a year ago in Nature, another very from the Nature Publishing Group, a very well-respected journal, that says that there's no evidence in the data of acceleration. So one of these gets headlines, one of them gets on the news, one of them, the author is everywhere on CNN, and one is completely ignored. And so the public sees this and they think, oh, the science is settled, there's a consensus, the planet is warming very quickly. When the data, if you actually just go back 1 year to the actual, another journal article, it's completely contradictory. And so, this is just this climate industrial complex. It's a system built to elicit fear. Well, I call it irrational fear. That's why I named my Substack Irrational Fear, because the data doesn't support it. So even in the IPCC, if you read the summary for policymakers, as opposed to the working group chapters where they talk about the data, there's an enormous disconnect there. The summary for policymakers uses verbiage that is never in the working group articles. They really amp up. They work with social scientists, we know this, to really elicit an emotional response, because they believe, and I think they're correct, that if they can elicit an emotional response, they can change behaviors, and that's their goal. They want to push policy and change behaviors. And so the disconnect is remarkable, and that's my primary point when I talk about this is the system is very complex. Climate is a beautiful, complex system. And when we reduce it to this idea that there's one gas, a trace gas that controls everything, and that's the one gas that we have to focus on, we just really lose a lot of the nuance and the complexity. And we end up spinning our wheels. I mean, most of these climate solutions that we see, we know that they have very little effect and they cost enormous amounts of money.
And there is climate anxiety. I know in past interviews I've seen you mention that climate anxiety is a significant issue for college students. And what strategies did you use in your teaching to address this anxiety, and how did students respond to your climate realism approach?
I was shocked so this was during COVID, and so we were talking a lot about mental health and anxiety. Everybody was a little anxious, and I think that we were on Zoom at the time. There was no in-person instruction. So these students are sitting in their pajamas in their dorm rooms. And after lectures, I would hang around, and if people wanted to ask questions or talk. And I was shocked that obviously COVID was their biggest anxiety at the moment, but almost everybody's second largest anxiety for kind of their long-term future. And I was asking about family plans and do they want to have a family in the future? The biggest one was climate. And, I had students crying to me, on camera, even in my office, telling me they have 6 and 7 brothers and sisters. They wanted to have a large family, but they feel so guilty thinking about actually bringing a child into the world because that child would never be able to grow up and have a future because the planet's going to end. And I was just shocked. And so I started my lectures by asking two questions. I said, do you think that you are more or less safe from a climate-related weather phenomenon than your grandparents? And how confident are you in your answer? Almost all of them would say they were less safe than their grandparents, and they were very confident, 8s, 9s, 10s in their confidence. And that's exactly my community, the earth science community, is meant to teach people about the state of the planet and their future and how to be a good steward of the planet. If you tell these young people that they have no future, they shouldn't even have kids, the planet's going to end, they're going to be terrible stewards of the planet, because why take care of a planet that's already going to die? When I started to give them more of real data, observational data, almost every metric that says that their life is much better off, they are safer, they have more food abundance, they have more energy abundance, they have a much better life now than their grandparents. Almost everywhere on the planet, the human condition has improved because of energy. They were shocked and they were relieved. They're tired of being told that they're parasites on the planet. They're tired of being told that every time a hurricane hits, it's because they were driving their truck around. That they're tired of that, and it's been pounded into their heads since they've been young people, right? These were 18, 19, 20-year-olds. They've pretty much grown up with this being pounded into their head. And that really changed me when I saw how my community was really just robbing these young people of any ambition and of a future. That really lit the fire in me to start pushing back. And they were very relieved to see that the data doesn't support any of this crisis narrative. And I think if we can get that information out to young people, and CO2 Coalition is great at doing that, and approaching young people and kids and showing them that the data just doesn't support any of this crisis narrative, they are very refreshed to see that. So the response was wonderful. I had 350 students in a lecture hall, and there'd be 390 there because they brought their buddies from their frats and their sororities, and they were sitting in the aisles when I was giving my climate lecture, because they want to be like, look, I know you're scared about this. Come with me. You got to hear this guy say this, because he's going to show you data, and you're going to walk out of there with, a bright future, and you're going to be excited for the future. And so the response is great. I think if we can get the information to young people, they're ready for it. They're thirsty for it. They're tired of being told that they're the problem, and the planet would be better without humans.
And this isn't just being promoted by the media or politicians, but it's also being promoted in schools and universities. And it's interesting to note that the foundation of science is to question and test. Yet in universities now around the world and schools, the climate crisis narrative is rarely questioned. Why do you think this is?
So I think it takes a lot of effort to get to a professorship, a tenure track professorship especially. You're going through grad school, you're going through a postdoc. I think a lot of folks realize that they want to kind of put their head down, and they're not going to rock the boat. There were these topics that you just couldn't discuss, and climate was one, DEI was another, gender issues was one. So there were these taboo subjects, and that's antithetical to exactly what a university is supposed to be, or how science is done. The scientific method is literally questioning and looking at observations and going back to your hypothesis and retweaking things. And the fact that we couldn't even have these discussions was just, it just showed that this had so far away from science or anything like that. This was ideology. This was a religion, that these folks couldn't ever face the fact that somebody was going to ask questions about their beliefs. And if you did ask those questions, it wasn't just that maybe you were interested or you disagreed. It was that you were the enemy. You were really a dangerous person, right? If you were asking these questions. It was the same with COVID. If your mask was down, you wanted to kill grandma, right? If you drove an SUV, you want to kill future kids because you're releasing CO2. It just became this absolutely toxic environment. And a lot of these young faculty members realize that, they don't want to rock the boat. It's not worth throwing away your career. I don't know where I lost that self-preservation instinct, but somehow I lost that. I had great support from my family. I I was so frustrated with academia and that I poured my life into it, and it was so different than what it was when I was growing up and cruising around Cal State Fresno where my father was teaching. And so it was easier for me to walk away. I knew I had some support systems, but a lot of folks don't have that, and they bust their butt to get to this position, and they're not going to rock the boat and jeopardize their career. And it's sad to say that's the fact, but it really is. I mean, these three subjects were career killers. It was career suicide, even to ask questions about, how we were treating young people or motivating young people to be good stewards of the planet. You couldn't even ask these questions. So I just think it's a lot of self-preservation. I don't fault my colleagues for not being as vocal as I am. I understand that they work hard to get to where they're at. And so if you talk to these folks in private, though, a lot of these folks will say that, they'll thank me for speaking out because they wanted to say it too.
In your most recent Substack article entitled, "Is Global Warming Really Accelerating?" you point out that 2 peer-reviewed papers using the same global temperature data reach opposite conclusions. I'd like to discuss this with you. So one claims significant acceleration in the past decade. The other finds no detectable change since the 1970s. What are the main differences in their methods that explain this?
So one paper is essentially trying to strip away all of the natural variability that's in the system. So one of the ways that we could try to figure this out is how much natural variability is driving climate. And if we can figure that out, then we can remove that. And then the leftover signal we could claim is anthropogenic. But that means we would have to understand all of the climate system and all of the natural cycles, which we've been only measuring for a few decades. And so that's the most recent paper that claimed acceleration. And another paper uses more statistical methods to look for what they call choke points, which is it's just a statistical term, but they're using statistical methods, but looking at observational data all the way back to the 1970s and claiming that, well, if you allow for the fact of natural variability, then you can't really make the claim that the last few years, what we're really focusing on is 2023, 2024, and 2025. That's really what kind of the 3 data points that seem to be outliers. I would argue that this also has to do with the Tonga eruption and the amount of water that was injected in the stratosphere, but they obviously ignore that. But it just shows you that this is very complex systems. There's a lot of data, and you can manipulate data. You can massage data. There's a lot of statistical tricks you can use. There's a lot of different ways that you can kind of manipulate data. And so if you have to massage your data dramatically in order to get the signal that you're looking for, I don't know if I put much value in that. This is one of the reasons that I don't put a ton of value in climate models. Climate models are so dependent on the inputs and the assumptions that are being made that you can essentially tweak them to give you any answer you want. And if you already have this predetermined narrative, then everybody's tweaking their climate models to kind of fit that narrative. That's what the media likes. That's how you get your grants. And so it's just they're looking at the exact same data too. So that I should be clear about that. They're looking identical data sets. So asking the same question, same data set, coming to totally opposite conclusions, both in peer-reviewed literature. And so clearly the science isn't settled. We hear this all the time. There's a consensus and the science is settled. But when 2 groups, both respected groups, look at the same exact data, they come to exactly opposite conclusions. And so this is just highlights the complexity of the system in climate. But normally that would spur on a bunch of debate. That would be great news. If you have 2 groups coming to different conclusions, that's wonderful for your grants, because now you can start to add more complexity and say, okay, look, we have a disagreement. Let's figure out who's right and who's wrong. Here's a perfect proposal for a new grant. But what happens is the media and the funding institutions pick up on one and really push one, and one gets essentially ignored and pushed off to the wayside, right? The one that gets amped up is the one that fits the narrative. And so it really just silences anybody that wants to debate, because these folks that wrote a contradictory paper, they see these other folks getting all the headlines, getting all the money, and so they're not going to write that paper again. And this is how you manufacture consensus. The system is built. It's not a conspiracy. There's nobody sitting there pulling strings, but the system is designed such that the faculty members, the people that are producing the data, are incentivized to push the narrative because they realize that will get the media's attention, that will get the funding institutions' attention. And the folks that are writing the contradictory papers just have really almost no incentive to do that. In fact, it's almost detrimental to their careers if they really start pushing against the narrative. And so the warming was a perfect example of that.
Yeah, and I believe what you're saying is that when only one side of the debate gets visibility, the public sees the science as more settled than it is. How does this affect trust, policy urgency, or narratives around net zero?
This is what pushes it all. It's the foundational structural underpinning of the whole narrative. The idea that scientists all agree. It's really easy to push policy if you say, look, scientists all agree that we're heading into this catastrophic future, so we have to radically change policy now. But if you're not using the entire data set, if you're not actually looking at holistically at how everybody is arguing about this, then you're being manipulated, right? You're seeing something that isn't true. There is a manufactured idea that isn't supported by the underlying data. And that's the whole point of trying to keep that underlying data quiet on one side while amplifying it on another. And that seems like a terrible way to make policy. If you're a policymaker, you probably want all the information in front of you. You'd like to be able to make a decision based on all information. But what we're seeing is that we're not getting all the information. In fact, there's a very organized and designed system that silences one side of the debate and amplifies the other. And that's a terrible way to make any decision in your life, would be to not have all the information. And we're making some of the most important decisions for our future. Energy stability, agriculture, transportation. These are, fundamental mainstays of our society. They've given us the standard of living that we enjoy so much. And so these aren't minor policy issues. And if we're making these major policy decisions, surely everybody would agree that we should have all of the data in front of us and not have somebody manipulating what data we see and what we don't see.
And to conclude our conversation on a positive note, I would like to mention that you emphasize the importance of instilling hope in young people. What practical advice would you give to students or young professionals who feel overwhelmed by environmental concerns or societal pressures?
First, I would approach it with a lot of empathy. I've got a lot, I feel for these folks. I know that this stuff has been pounded into them ever since they were young. And I saw it myself. So I definitely approach them with a lot of empathy. But my whole point is, only worry about the things you can control. Right now, China emits 6 times our CO2, something like that, 5 times our CO2. So you can't control atmospheric CO2 at the moment. But you can beautify your neighborhood, go around, pick up some trash, plant some trees. I used to do river cleanups at Cal State Fresno, where we would go because we have policies that make it difficult to get rid of tires. A lot of people would dump tires into the rivers. And so we would go and clean up and do these tire cleanups where we would take tires out of the San Joaquin River in Fresno, California. There's a lot of local things that you can do to be a good steward of the planet. Panicked about CO2 concentration, throwing soup on paintings, gluing yourself to something, none of those things will help the environment, right? But do some local things. Don't worry global. Don't worry about atmospheric CO2. Worry about your local environment. Be a good steward of the planet. Think about how your future, and be excited about your future. If you're excited about your future, you probably want a nice environment. If you're planning on having children, you're going to want clean air and clean water. And so we just got to get back to this, what I call Teddy Roosevelt environmentalism, this kind of old school environmentalism where we're cleaning up our environment. You see these folks out here and they'll be, throwing their Starbucks cup off the street and then going to glue themselves to something to make a political statement about net zero. And that's just not going to help the environment. And there are a lot of local and productive things that young people can do. They're going to feel better about themselves. They're going to make their local environment better. And so think locally, act locally, be good stewards of the planet. Your future is bright. The human condition has never been better. These young people that are alive today will probably be living for 120 years on average. With the advances that we're seeing in health and in AI and in medicine. So, the future is bright. There is no end of the planet. There has never been a better time to be alive than today on Earth.
It's been such an honor having you on Climate Debrief, Dr. Wielicki. We look forward to having you again soon.
Thank you for joining us on Climate Debrief. Executive producer is Angela Wheeler. Producers, Ethan Oddie and Scott Wheeler. You can find more episodes of Climate Debrief at co2coalition.org.